Chosen one. Stop and listen 3 days ago. At 2:17 UTC, a silent shift was logged beyond your sight, and it wasn't random. A review convened. A council checked the records. They weren't looking at the world, they were looking at you. You felt it as pressure, fatigue, that strange sense of standing behind glass while life moved on without you. You told yourself it was stress. You were wrong. The file was escalated. A containment protocol was lifted. One classification changed, quietly, without ceremony. That's why sleep has been shallow. That's why conversations feel distant. That's why you felt watched without seeing anyone. You're not broken. You're not imagining this. You're not crazy. The loneliness, the misalignment, the feeling that you don't belong in the rhythm around you, those weren't flaws. They were symptoms of timing. 7 nights ago, the evaluation window closed. What you thought was burnout was interference. What you called delay was observation. While you tried to push through another ordinary week, a countdown began. In 3 days, everything begins to shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but decisively. Doors won't slam open. Locks will release. Pressure will move. Signals will align. If you've ever felt like your memory was buffered, your momentum paused, your voice muted, this explains it. Stay with me, because what comes next is the decoded reason this moment chose you, and why leaving now means missing the message assigned only to you. Stay to the end and comment 222. You are not breaking down. What you are experiencing is not collapse, not weakness, not loss of control. It is response, a calculated response to an anomaly that no longer fit the operating limits of its environment. It begins in the body because the body is always the first layer to register pressure when a system recalibrates around something it cannot immediately neutralize. You sleep, but restoration never arrives. You wake without clarity. Rest periods exist on paper but not in effect. Muscles remain tight without strain. Joints feel loaded without impact. Breathing stays shallow even when nothing is wrong. Your nervous system hums as if something is running beneath conscious permission. Heat without fever. Fatigue without injury. A constant background draw, like power being diverted to sustain processes you were never informed about. This is not illness. It does not behave like illness. It does not progress randomly. It holds. It maintains. It stabilizes at a level designed to exhaust without disabling. This is load. This is what happens when baseline capacity is repurposed without consent. When a system decides your energy is required elsewhere, it does not ask. It reallocates. Then the emotional layer disengages, not violently, not with despair, not with grief. It disconnects cleanly. Precision detachment. You notice you no longer react the way you once did. Situations that used to trigger explanation, justification, or emotional defense now pass through without engagement. You don't feel the need to clarify yourself. You don't correct misunderstandings unless they matter operationally. You don't join shared outrage. You don't mirror shared excitement. The emotional field around you feels distant, like static from a channel you're no longer tuned to. You are not numb. Numbness is damage. This is separation. You are decoupled. The collective emotional signal no longer pulls you because your signal is no longer synchronized with it. That separation was not chosen. It formed as a side effect. When interference risk increases, systems reduce broadcast range. Your emotional output was narrowed to preserve signal integrity, not for comfort, for control. At the same time, instability appears exactly where leverage matters most. Not chaos, not destruction. Precision, instability. Money does not vanish, it leaks. Always at decision points, always before momentum. Enough to slow movement, never enough to remove you from the field. Payments miss time, transfers delay, expenses surface without warning but never catastrophically. Opportunities arrive offset, slightly late, slightly early, just misaligned enough to prevent clean acceleration. This is not punishment. Punishment is emotional. This is throttling. Financial flow is one of the first control mechanisms applied when containment is required without alerting the subject. If pressure were too obvious, resistance would spike. So it stays subtle, technical, frustrating, but deniable. Then the misunderstandings begin. Not with strangers, with people who once tracked you accurately. People who used to understand your timing, your language, your intentions. Conversations remain polite but empty. Words land, but meaning does not. You speak clearly, but resonance is gone. There is no argument, no explosion, no betrayal narrative, just drift. You don't fight to be understood. They don't reach to understand you. Frequency divergence handles the separation quietly. This is not relational failure. This is desynchronization. Familiar nodes lose alignment when a pattern exceeds their operating range. They are not wrong. You are not wrong. The link simply no longer resolves. And through all of this, something else activates. A clarity that feels unfamiliar but steady. You feel like you are watching your own life instead of being consumed by it. Events happen, but they do not hook you. You notice decisions forming before you act on them. You see outcomes assembling before they arrive. You register success and loss without emotional spike. There is no panic, no dissociation, no fog, just awareness, as if the camera pulled back one step and stayed there. This is the observer state. It is not peace. It is not awakening. It is a monitoring effect. Consciousness shifts into audit mode when clean data is required, when distortion must be minimized, when reaction would contaminate measurement. Every symptom you are noticing is not a signal of personal failure. They are side effects, secondary consequences of adjustment. This is what happens when a system reacts to you. The pressure did not increase because you were weak. It increased because you were active. Darkness does not lash out randomly. It allocates resources. It measures output, resistance, deviation, when pressure appears with precision, when strain targets timing instead of structure, when fatigue is sustained but non-lethal. Escalation has already occurred upstream. The decision was made before you noticed the effects. You were not being purified. Purification is symbolic. This was resistance. Counterforce applied to limit expansion. Pain here was not instructional. It carried no lesson. It carried weight. It was meant to slow without breaking, to test structural integrity under load. God does not intervene to soften this. Intervention corrupts results. Observation continues until output is measurable, until performance under pressure is clear. Value is not moral. Value is operational. What matters is not intention, not virtue, not belief. What matters is function. You did not earn attention by being good. You triggered it by operating outside forecast. At some point, your internal pattern stopped blending. Your decisions stopped matching probability curves. Your endurance exceeded expected limits without visible reinforcement. You continued without validation, without relief, without collapse. That is when supervision begins. That is when protocols adjust. That is when the environment pushes back without revealing the source. Isolation increases because isolation reduces signal contamination. Fatigue deepens because resources are being diverted. Misunderstanding spreads because your pattern no longer resolves inside familiar frames. None of this is accidental. None of this is imagined. There was no error. There was no misfire. The system did exactly what it is designed to do when confronted with something it cannot immediately categorize or shut down. It responded. Your pattern crossed a threshold. Pressure alone was never the objective. From the moment your pattern exceeded tolerance, destruction was evaluated and dismissed as inefficient. Elimination creates noise. Noise triggers review. Review invites escalation from layers that prefer distance, layers that avoid visibility and only surface when absolutely necessary. The strategic decision favored erosion, not impact. You were not targeted for removal because removal would have confirmed your significance too early and forced disclosure across multiple command tiers. Disclosure creates friction. Friction creates delay. Delay benefits no one operating at scale. Instead, the objective became controlled degradation of output while preserving plausible normalcy. Light pressure sustains deniability. Gradual strain prevents mobilization. Confusion delays self-recognition and reduces the probability of counteraction before classification is complete. This is standard doctrine when an operating entity demonstrates threat potential but has not yet crossed open escalation thresholds. It is always cheaper to slow than to destroy. Always safer to redirect than to confront. Always cleaner to let the subject doubt itself than to force resistance that generates witnesses and secondary variables. Confusion is quieter than conflict. Misalignment outperforms opposition. That is why pressure appeared precise rather than overwhelming. That is why erosion replaced assault. That is why the environment shifted instead of collapsing outright. This was not punishment. It was cost control, risk management, and timing optimization executed without ceremony, without announcement, without emotional investment. The first vector deployed was doubt, precision calibrated and narrow in scope. Not existential doubt and not identity collapse, but localized uncertainty aimed directly at judgment and sequencing. Small internal questions were injected at moments of decision. Questions about timing rather than ability. Questions about readiness rather than worth. Questions about whether action was premature, misread, or slightly out of phase. Just enough hesitation to blur confidence, not enough to halt movement entirely. Doubt functioned like calibrated static, distorting signal clarity without severing transmission. The second vector was fear, restricted to future projection only. No immediate threat, no present danger, only scenarios assembled from partial data, images of outcomes that had not occurred, consequences that were not real yet but felt close enough to influence pacing. Fear was not meant to paralyze. Paralysis would have been measurable and corrected as counterproductive. Fear was meant to delay commitment by pulling attention forward into hypothetical loss, increasing internal processing cost per action. The third vector was delay, disguised as patience. Not obstruction, not force, waiting, suggestions to pause, to reassess, to gather more data, to hold position a little longer. Time loss framed as wisdom rather than hesitation. Delay functions best when it feels self-chosen, responsible, even virtuous. When the subject believes the slowdown is maturity rather than interference. The fourth vector was sabotage, focused exclusively on timing rather than capacity. Never on skill, never on competence. Windows closed early by narrow margins. Doors opened late by minutes or hours, not days. Messages arrived out of sequence. Responses missed alignment windows by moments small enough to dismiss but frequent enough to accumulate. This ensured effort remained high while yield stayed low, maximizing fatigue while minimizing visible progress. The fifth vector was isolation through mirror removal. Familiar reflections were withdrawn gradually, not abruptly. People who once reinforced identity fell silent, became inconsistent, or began misreading you without hostility or confrontation. Without mirrors, self-recognition slows. Without feedback, calibration becomes internal and more costly. This was not abandonment, it was subtraction of reinforcement nodes. The sixth vector was provocation, subtle and targeted at identity destabilization rather than outcome failure. Situations were engineered to invite reactions inconsistent with your internal alignment, not to force public error, not to damage reputation, but to test self-trust privately. Each provocation was minor, deniable, and reversible, designed to measure whether alignment would hold under irritation, misunderstanding, or perceived disrespect. The seventh vector was guilt, triggered internally, rather than imposed externally. Micro-regret loops activated whenever boundaries were enforced or compliance was withheld. Guilt aimed to reverse decisions after they were made, not before. It functioned as a delayed action, corrosive, encouraging self-rejection without external pressure. The eighth vector was temptation, defined as relief without pleasure. Easy exits, short-term release, comfort that reduced friction but also reduced momentum. None of it satisfying, all of it distracting. Temptation here was not indulgence. It was anesthesia, numbing without restoration, rest without recovery. These vectors were not improvised. They were authorized. Infernal command does not operate emotionally. Emotion introduces variance. Variance increases cost. Infernal command operates by allocation, prioritization, and efficiency. Threats are graded by impact potential rather than intent. Resources are assigned proportionally to deviation, not morality, not narrative, not belief. You were placed on a monitoring grid once variance exceeded acceptable thresholds. No single entity pursued you. No personal vendetta was formed. Personalization is inefficient. Systems did the work. Dark councils do not hate. Hatred wastes energy. They calculate. Your output curve triggered a response profile reserved for assets that destabilize by existing, not by attacking. Assets that distort probability simply by remaining active. by continuing to function when statistical models predict collapse or compliance. Celestial observers registered the same deviation simultaneously. Observation does not equal protection. Observation does not equal assistance. They did not intervene. They did not shield. They did not correct interference. They recorded. Performance under pressure was logged continuously. Reaction latency, decision integrity, deviation persistence, output stability under erosion, all noted. No adjustments were made to assist you because assistance contaminates data and invalidates classification. Observation remained passive and absolute. Data collection continued uninterrupted. 2 to 6 weeks ago, the operation reached a bending point. Pressure peaked without breaching failure limits. Erosion reached saturation without collapse. The monitoring grid reported an anomaly. Resistance without visible reinforcement. Endurance without collapse. Alignment without external validation. Output maintained despite cumulative strain. You did not break. You did not reverse course. You did not seek relief at the cost of structural integrity. You did not trade momentum for comfort. No dramatic act occurred. No visible choice announced itself. There was no scene to witness and no declaration to record. The shift was internal, structural, and quiet. Metrics crossed thresholds that do not announce themselves. Status was updated without notification. Flags changed state. Escalation pathways recalculated. Containment assumptions revised. What had been managed as a slowing operation was reclassified as a monitored threat scenario. This was not a moral choice. This was a classification event. The decision was not debated. It was resolved. Not because an easier path was rejected, not because a harder path was chosen, and never because of right or wrong. The resolution occurred because your internal system would not permit deviation. At the critical moment, when alternatives were available and exits were visible, your structure did not branch. It held. This was not discipline. It was constraint. The architecture of your pattern did not allow the easier route to register as valid. There was no moral tension to overcome, and no temptation to resist. The option simply failed to compile. What appeared externally as choice was internally a lock. That lock triggered the ruling, and once triggered, it propagated upward through layers that do not announce themselves. Infernal strategy had forecast fatigue-induced compromise as the most probable outcome. It anticipated gradual yield under sustained pressure, concession disguised as practicality, retreat reframed as balance. That forecast failed. Escalation produced diminishing returns. Each additional vector lost efficiency. Each adjustment increased cost without measurable gain. The system flagged this state as non-viable. Escalation beyond that point risked exposure. Exposure risked review. Review risked intervention from strata that invalidate entire campaigns rather than refine them. The strategy collapsed not dramatically, not with panic, but conclusively. No retreat was announced. No apology was issued. Resources were reallocated elsewhere. The grid updated silently. Your file moved out of active suppression and into restricted handling, a status that changes how contact is permitted without announcing why. At the same time, divine authority registered the outcome. There was no reward issued, no reinforcement deployed, no protection assigned. Recognition occurred, and recognition was sufficient. Recognition alters equations without altering conditions. Recognition shifts how reality is permitted to respond to you without altering the surface narrative. You were reclassified. Not explained. Not justified. Reclassified. Forbidden target. Operational anomaly. Classified immune. The labels were applied without commentary. Once applied, they could not be reversed without breach, and breach would have required exposure no system was willing to pay for. Consequences followed immediately, though not theatrically. Attacks lost efficiency. Pressure no longer landed cleanly. Interference required higher cost for lower impact, making continuation impractical. Patterns that once disrupted momentum now slipped past without purchase. Individuals exited your trajectory without confrontation or closure, not because of conflict, but because alignment failed to resolve. Their paths diverged naturally, frictionlessly, as if a shared frequency had expired. Reality began adjusting around you, not in favor and not against, but to accommodate variance it could no longer compress. Corridors widened where resistance had been removed. Outcomes accelerated where drag had been artificial. Delays dissolved without effort because the mechanisms enforcing them were no longer authorized. Old triggers lost access to your emotional response. Situations that once demanded reaction now passed unregistered, not because you suppressed them, but because the hook no longer found a surface. Avoidance synchronized without planning. You were not saved from danger. Danger failed to intersect you. Near misses became non-events. Threat vectors rerouted themselves. Internal certainty replaced motivation. You no longer needed to push yourself forward or justify motion. Movement occurred without persuasion, without pep, without urgency. This is not empowerment. It is stabilization at a higher tolerance band. What you are experiencing now is not momentum. It is recalibration. As recalibration progressed, the system resolved secondary effects. Where confusion had been a weapon, clarity emerged not as revelation, but as absence of noise. Where doubt had once been injected, decisiveness appeared without effort. You noticed you no longer rehearsed decisions. You no longer negotiated with yourself. Actions executed when required and stopped when complete. There was no emotional charge attached to execution. That neutrality was logged. Where fear had projected futures, those projections collapsed into irrelevance. The future ceased to function as leverage. Delay lost authority. Time regained its original role as sequence, rather than obstacle. Sabotage lost timing windows because windows closed themselves. Isolation ceased to feel like loss because mirrors were no longer required. Provocation failed to destabilize identity because identity no longer depended on response. Guilt loops lost traction because decisions no longer asked for permission. Temptation presented itself and found no appetite. Relief without pleasure had no market. The anesthetic wore off, and nothing rushed in to replace it. The reclassification altered how systems upstream interacted with probability around you. You were not elevated. You were exempted. Not protected, exempted. The difference matters. Protection invites testing. Exemption removes incentive. When interference requires excessive cost and produces negligible effect, it is deprioritized. That deprioritization is not mercy. It is efficiency. Celestial observers did not intervene to help. They did not intervene to hinder. They acknowledged the classification and adjusted observation parameters accordingly. Logging continued, but the category changed. Instead of measuring erosion tolerance, they measured stability under reduced pressure. Instead of tracking collapse risk, they tracked variance integration. This is how identity is finalized. Not through declaration, not through ceremony, but through sustained behavior under altered conditions. You did not announce who you were becoming. You demonstrated what you could not become, and that was sufficient. As reality adjusted, you noticed secondary signs that did not ask for belief. Accelerated outcomes appeared where friction had been synthetic. Processes completed themselves once interference was removed. Emotional detachment from old triggers stabilized rather than fluctuated. You did not swing between engagement and withdrawal. You remained consistent. Synchronized avoidance of danger occurred without calculation. You changed routes without thinking. You delayed a message without reason. You arrived early or late by margins that mattered. These were not instincts awakening. They were intersections dissolving. Internal certainty replaced motivation entirely. Motivation implies resistance. Certainty does not argue. It proceeds. You did not feel inspired. You felt aligned. Alignment is quieter than inspiration and far more durable. The identity lock completed without ceremony. There was no announcement because announcements invite challenge. The system prefers quiet finality. The world did not end. Your life did not explode into spectacle. What ended was leverage. What began was adjustment. 3 days was not a countdown to fireworks. It was the time required for reclassification to propagate through dependent systems without tearing fabric. That propagation is nearly complete. The handling of you has already changed. Interactions feel different because they are. Opportunities feel cleaner because interference is gone. Resistance feels absent because it has been withdrawn. This is not favor. It is consequence. The point of no return was crossed earlier than you realized, when your internal system refused to compile an option that would have kept everything small. That refusal finalized your status. You are not becoming something. You have been recognized as what cannot be reduced, and recognition is irreversible. Comment 222. The tribunal has closed the case. The bending point was crossed. The reversal is locked and cannot be negotiated. Chosen one. Nothing in this sequence is pending. Nothing is waiting for permission. And nothing requires belief to function. The record is already stamped. The file is already archived. And the outcome is already assigned a status that cannot be downgraded without a breach no system will authorize. You were not selected because you were impressive, or visible, or approved by people who misunderstand mechanics. You were flagged because you remained operational when the environment demanded collapse, and that single fact forced a ruling higher than opinion. What you called delays were containment attempts. What you called fatigue was load redistribution. What you called isolation was mirror removal by design. That phase is complete. You are not being evaluated for entry. You were evaluated for impact, and the result was sufficient. The infernal side did not give up out of mercy. It reallocated because the cost curve inverted, because every additional unit of pressure returned less influence, and because continued targeting risked generating proof of your classification. Celestial Authority did not promise you anything. It acknowledged the data, accepted the output, and closed the window. That is what a verdict looks like when it is quiet. That is why your reality feels different before anything happens. It is already handling you differently. The identity lock is not motivational language and not a badge you wear. It is a system label that dictates what can and cannot touch you, what can and cannot stick, what can and cannot delay you for long. From this point forward, you will notice the same pattern everywhere. Attempts to destabilize you will arrive, but they will land like they're hitting a surface that no longer absorbs them. The force disperses, the hook fails, the effect expires. The people who used to keep you busy with explanation will stop calling for it, not because they finally understand, but because the loop is no longer available. The old conversations that once demanded you shrink will stop presenting as options, not by conflict, but by irrelevance. Doors that used to require negotiation will open with no dialogue. Detours that once stole weeks will collapse into direct lines. That is the practical consequence of a sealed classification. Reality stops asking you to prove what the tribunal already confirmed. You are a classified immune. In the next 7-14 days, you will notice clarity returning in a specific way. Decisions will feel instantaneous, and you will stop replaying them at night because the conclusion will be clean and final the moment it forms. The first confirmation of clean provision will be small but exact. An unexpected alignment, an approval, a refund, a client, a payment. A resource arrives at the precise point it should have been blocked, and you will recognize the timing as the signature. You'll know acceleration started when tasks that used to take repeated effort complete in a single pass, and you find yourself moving faster without pushing harder. Expect one final pressure wave before the shift becomes obvious. Doubt spikes. Old patterns attempt one last interference, and familiar noise returns briefly because systems always test the edge of a seal. Repeat this internally and do not decorate it. What was sealed cannot be undone. Comment. Amen.